So this is an open session. Right, we're going to make a start, everybody. Councillors, we're making a start. Do I need to get out the gavel? Okay, welcome to this extra briefing on the Representation Review 2024. Just making sure we have some clear ideas about what the report will look like when it comes to council next week, noting we're not making any decisions today, but just trying to give a bit of guidance about what might be our options in the report. So I'll pass over to staff. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. This is just an extra briefing that you have requested as a result of the briefing on the 8th of October. And I'm not going to summarise the analysis of the submissions again unless it's necessary. The purpose of today's briefing was to discuss the background of the Macron on the A in Kapiti, as you've requested, and then also discuss the impacts of having the Macron either there or not there, and in relation to the representation review specifically, and also provide an opportunity to discuss the community board appointments again if you wish to do so. And just to provide a little bit of an introduction in relation to this briefing. So it is in relation to the representation review. So we can discuss the Macron and Kapiti, but there will need to be a decision in relation to the representation review that council will have to make next week. And there may need to be further work on the Macron after that. So I just wanted to quickly recap why we're having a discussion around the Macron. Mana Whenua, they have provided a submission as part of the formal consultation process, and they confirmed that they are supportive of the initial proposal, the name Kapiti Coast Māori Ward, but that they would like us to consider removing the Macron from the A. And this is what has led to this. So I'm handing over to Hara now to have a quick kōrero about the Macron.
Right? Oh, kia ora tātou, that's all right. I think it's coming. So we're just going to have a quick kōrero around the origins of the name of Kapiti and how we land here today with the Macron. So the original name for the island is Te Waiwai Kapiti or Tararaua ko Rangitane. So previous to Mana Whenua occupation, this coast was belonged to descendants of the Kurahopo waka, which is reflective in the name, namely Ngaitara and Rangitane. So Te Waiwai Kapiti or Tararaua ko Rangitane translates to the island as the meeting point, the joining of the boundaries of two iwi. The history behind that is through the Kurahopo waka and Whātonga being the captain of that waka. On his arrival to the area, he sliced boundaries. So from the southern tip of Kapiti Island straight across to the east was the boundary. North of that, he gave to Rangitane, and south of that, he gave to Tara. So slide 2. So with the Macron today, in 2010, Te Taura Whiri o Te Reo Māori acknowledged that whilst the ordinary word Kapiti was without a Macron, they acknowledged that through the Mana Whenua here today, the Tainui Waka descendants, have researched through history and pronunciation of recordings of pronunciation, the A was elongated. And so through further research, we landed on the kupu Kapiti with the Macron being a variation of Apiti, which is Apiti, he Apiti hono, he tātai hono, which translates to join the lines together. So that whakatauki or phrase is usually used when with the joining of life and death. So he apiti hono, he tātai hono, you'll hear it spoken on the marae. te hunga mate ki te hunga mate, te hunga ora ki te hunga ora. So it's joining those two things together. Yeah, I think is that the last slide? Yeah. Kia ora.
Okay. I might invite comment from Kim. Is that all right, Kim?
So when this was brought to the table, so basically we were asked to give a name to the Māori ward, and we considered some options, and what was the final name that was given? Kapiti Coast Māori ward. And so historically, we have not written it with a macron, and there are, like, as Hada's pointed out, the history of it. I'm not the historian, so that's why I said it's best that we get the history around what that is. So technically, being a non-written language, macrons and double A's and all this kind of stuff does not really feature. But now we're in these times and we've got macrons, and Kapiti has historically had a macron. So this Kapiti Coast Māori ward, we saw this in the light of this position and this role. We did not see this in any bigger role, and it was just the way that we would write it. And there is history there to speak to both reasons, why it should have a macron and shouldn't have a macron. I'm not here to say that there's any right or wrong answer to that. But what we were speaking about was the name of the ward councillor. And that's where we thought about when we looked at this name, and it was just specific to that. It wasn't about a rebranding, it wasn't about anything like that. We were just talking about given the option to name the member that's going to come in under this position, understanding the political agenda around it and all that's going to entail. But that's where our thinking was. It was no broader than that. And then this conversation has come out of that. But as to the history of it, whether it's got a macron or it doesn't have a macron, it's just as Hara says, you know, it's been taken from something, it has had it there, but if it, depending on who you speak to, if you go to Ngāti Toa, I believe, you know, and even with our own, we traditionally don't put a macron on the kapiti. Yeah, so that's where it comes from our perspective.
So the submission was from Ngā Hapu?
Yep, signed by Auntie Denise, yeah.
Yeah, and did we get any submissions from other iwi?
So the wording in the submission, it was signed by Denise Hapera. It said it was on behalf of the Art Forum.
Okay.
So
was
no,
with the
we
Art
didn't
Forum.
receive any other
So that was
separate
that's
ones.
Clear. Just good to have that clear. So I just want to ask you, Kim, do you think it would be a big deal if we did have a macron on it for consistency and to avoid a distraction coming into what's going to be a really difficult debate anyway?
That is probably a question that I couldn't answer on my own. That is a conversation that we would have to look at and actually get in a room about, because it's not something that I can sit here as Ngā Hapu, whereas Bai Denise has put that letter on the line and talk to our art members. I have not had that conversation. So we would need to have a korero about that. Yeah, because that was the name that's given, and traditionally, once a name is given, we don't normally tend to take that name back. But that is a conversation that you could have. But I think, you know, for prudence sake, you should have all three art iwi in the room when you have that korero.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have had a few conversations about it, and on the surface of it, it doesn't seem like it's something that's hugely important at this time. It was more to put it on the table as something that could be progressed in the future. I personally think that it's going to be confusing to have a different name at this point, a differently spelt name at this point. And I'd be in favour of keeping the Māori ward name consistent with the name of the district. If it's the same word, keep the spelling consistent, but make a commitment to have this conversation, to have a look at how we spell kapiti and look at that properly rather than in the context of a representation review. Who have I got next? Nigel.
Yeah, this will be music to the ears of Martin Warrener, who was the staunch anti-Macron campaigner for 20 years, or a bit longer than 20 years actually, since this was introduced. Just wondering, we're not the uppity coast. Well, we spell with a U. Yeah. So I just wondered about that. So I mean, there's a bit of a history lesson in this. That's what I'm thinking. But also, just a little bit of concern about the unintended consequences, as Janet's raised. So two things for me. One is I would like to do what is the historically accurate thing to do. If that's what we've got, then that's cool. And if it's not what we've got, then that's what we need. That's what we should do. In the meantime, every piece of stationery has got macrons on it now. I do know there's a magnificent online newspaper in Kapiti that uses the macron all the time. I think when the voting papers go out, for instance, it'll be for the Kapiti coast with a macron. And so it's just, again, it's not a bit, there's a consistency argument, yes, certainly, but it could be that we have been doing it wrong. And now, so this is how science works, right? You go with what you go with until somebody comes up and says, well, actually, this is what it really is. So there's been more research. There's been, if the finding is that there isn't a macron, then perhaps we, over time, next time we print things or online stuff's easy enough, you just take it away, if that's what it's supposed to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got Kim again next.
I just wanted to touch on what you said about putting the macron back on. It seems, this conversation seems odd to me. But if we are going to change any name that has been given for mana whenua, we need to have that conversation with mana whenua to do that, I think. Just because it has been given, and understanding the unintended consequences, and keeping it in, because that's what we were given. We looked at it in that small context, and then obviously you've raised the unintended consequences. But if we are going to go and backtrack, have the conversation so that.
Hang on, we've lost the microphone. Can we put it back on, please? Might be a battery issue. Thank you.
Just have the conversation if we're going to change it. That's all.
Cool.
Can I just ask, was the
No,
company
you
out
can't
of
just
context?
ask without your microphone. Sorry, this is a live stream briefing. So, I'll go to Jocelyn.
Yeah, I actually think I jumped a few people.
Okay, Liz.
Oh, yeah. I'm just wondering why we brought the macron in however many years ago that it was, on what basis that was. It seems to me that we need to have consistent usage of it, and as it says on the slide there, it's overdue for a review. So I feel this is something we do need to consult with mana whenua on more widely. I think I agree with you that it's going to muddy the waters in terms of what we do with the representation review. But on the other hand, we can't go against the name that has been given by mana whenua for that ward. So I would suggest that we run with it as recommended by mana whenua, and then institute a process whereby we look at whether we need to change it across the board to fit in with that. I don't think we can disregard the views of mana whenua in terms of naming the ward, and it's kind of signalling there's a wider issue here, and I think we need to do the right thing. So yeah, I think it's it's rather problematic, but we have to get to the bottom of it somehow, and it's really mana whenua who need to decide which way it goes, and then we need to live with the consequences of that. If it means reprinting our stationery and re-signing, redoing all our signs and vehicle signs and heaven knows what, well, maybe that's what we've got to do over a period of time. But anyway, why did we bring it in the first place? I know there was a hoo-ha at the time we brought it in. Does anyone know what the rationale for that was?
Do we have an answer for that? Hada? Yeah.
Jenny was there, yeah. When it was introduced, yeah, and Te Wari, yeah.
We can always come back with an answer to that. I don't know if it's relevant today. Yeah, it's part of our wider discussion around it, maybe. Maybe today is simply as simple as we've been given a name, we run with it. Shelley?
I agree with Liz. I think mana whenua, this is their person. It's Māori and wider iwi, wider Māori, but maybe it will just make the conversation happen that we need to, and so we run with it, because for a long time everyone thought the earth was flat, and now we got used to the fact that it's round. So, we've had a macron, maybe we'll just get used to not having a macron if that's the appropriate thing. But it will spur on a conversation. We don't have to rush it, because it will cost money to change, but maybe we change it over time. But I agree with
This is
Tim.
the first step. Jocelyn?
Yeah, so thank you. I was going to make exactly the same comment with Liz. So, to me, I'm not concerned about whether it has a macron or not, but I accept that iwi have given us a ward name and we should run with that. But it raises the question to me, what was the process behind putting the macrons on Kapiti in the first instance? Was it actually a political decision, or was it actually one based on research?
Yeah, so
And
we've decided to park that question
yeah.
until we have the wider discussion. So, but good to table it again, because it highlights how important it is for us to find that
so
out.
I'm happy to run with what we've got.
Okay, great.
And then look at the bigger picture.
Good. Nigel?
Yeah, just can provide a little bit of that historical perspective. It was at the time when Jenny was the mayor, and Te Wari Kakik, who was no longer with us, sadly, lovely bloke, was an historian of sorts as well. And so that was when the macron got introduced. But there will have been, well, as Hara has already pointed out, there's been a lot more research since then. I just think if somebody gives you a name, particularly in this kind of context, then you're obligated to run with that name if you accept the name, right? But it's a bit like if somebody gives you a car, and a blue car, and you go, oh, thanks for the gift, but I think I'll paint it green, actually. Well, it's kind of not the same, is it? It's not what was given. So in this situation, if there's sound reasoning behind that, then run with it. But whether or not you change will be whether or not people are convinced by the historical arguments, which is what happened the first time round.
I think we're starting to get a bit of a steer as to what should go in the paper as our first option. Councillor Cooper?
Yeah, it won't surprise you with what I'm about to say. And I think this is where the sort of rubber hits the road with our partnership and our partnership with mana whenua. If mana whenua want that name for the award, then I think that's the right name that it should be. I think the wider discussion of Kapiti as a region dropping or having the macron is a completely different discussion. Probably not appropriate to have it. Well, it's not appropriate to have it now, but so I fully support if mana whenua want it, then I think we should run with it.
Cool.
Thank you.
I think we've got a steer. Great. So, of course, I don't think we'll probably need a discussion next week. We just wanted to make sure that we're all comfortable with that, because it is an inconsistency.
Yep.
I'm okay with that. Perfect, cool. So we'll run without the macron.
So
should not be regarded as a precedent necessarily for other words spelt that way to be spelt without a macron. Okay, so shall we head on with the presentation?
Yep. During the last briefing, you asked what the actual council appointments to community boards are in the initial proposal. And I've put it up on the screen because that wasn't in the last presentation. So the initial proposal currently outlines, so the initial proposal that we consulted on, outlines that Otaki would have one appointed member, so one councillor appointed, and that's either from the Otaki General Ward or the Kapiti Coast Māori Ward. Waikanai would also have one appointed member, either from the Waikanai General Ward or the Kapiti Coast Māori Ward. Paraparaumu would have two appointed members from the Paraparaumu General Ward and or the Kapiti Coast Māori Ward. Raumati one appointed member, once again, either General Ward Councillor or Māori Ward Councillor, and Paikakiriki the same as Raumati. And I just wanted to, at this point, just reiterate that if you were wanting to make changes to the initial proposal, you have to do so based on submissions. So if there were no submissions, you can't actually, under the legislation, adjust the initial proposal. And also, just to summarise it again, when you passed the initial proposal, the reason it was done like that was to keep it equitable, so, as equitable as possible, and the and or option was thrown in there, so when the new council is elected in the new triennium, you then have the flexibility as much as possible that isn't constrained by decisions today to then appoint either a general ward councillor or a Māori ward councillor and weigh up workloads and so forth. So it doesn't mean that the Māori Ward Council will be appointed to all community boards, but you have the flexibility in the new triennium to do so if that feels like the right thing to do at the time. And that will be part of the governance structure discussion. So I don't know if you wanted to have a discussion at this point.
I think it is important to have some reasoning as to why we have those numbers in front of us. Why are there two in Paraparaumu, but one in Waikanai? That's the question that keeps coming up. So can we have an answer to that, please?
Yes. So during the preliminary community engagement, we asked the community whether they're supportive of the current arrangements with community boards, including the appointment structure, and the majority supported the current structure and just supported leaving it the same. So that then led to the initial proposal that council then discussed in July and passed.
I just want to go a bit further.
Yep.
Why do we have the current structure? Why do we have two appointed members in Paraparaumu and one in Waikanai and the rest of the community boards?
That is as a result of the determination by the Local Government Commission, who made the decision to have one appointed member for Waikanai and two for Paraparaumu.
I'm guessing it's to do with population.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah, so Paraparaumu, under legislation, Paraparaumu cannot have more than two. But as we've discussed in previous sessions, Waikanai could have two under legislation.
I'll go to Lawrence.
I'm probably of the opinion that we need consistency, particularly the issue is obviously the Waikanai and Paraparaumu ones. And so my suggestion would probably be that we go for just one appointed member, again, because we want to highlight the community board's role, and having less councillors in those spaces I think is good, but having consistency across the whole district around community boards I think would be helpful and less confusing and becomes less of a conflict point, I would suggest. So that would be my thought. Do we have a question, Steffi? Do we have a submission? If we were to change this, what's on the screen, and bring it back to one for Paraparaumu, do we have a submission for that, in support of that?
So I actually have a slide with the submission, so maybe I'll just quickly take you through that, and that may answer your question.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I just brought this slide back just to reiterate that the formal consultation that we've just undertaken, actually 80% of the submitters supported the initial proposal. So what I've just brought up with the 1 and 2 for Waikanae and Paraparaumu. However, you did ask whether there are any submissions during the last briefing, and there were 5 submissions, none in relation to supporting it. There were no comments in relation to supporting 2 on Paraparaumu or 1 on Waikanae. There was nothing mentioned. But there were 5 submissions in relation to why they didn't support the initial proposal. And that's 5 submissions out of the 20%, the 87. So it's already quite a small number. But those 5 submissions, 2 were written submissions that were received outside the system, and they actually said the same thing, exactly the same wording. They were just signed by different people. And I can read that out. They mentioned that there is a disparity in the appointment process of councillors to community boards. Paraparaumu has the right for 2, whilst Waikanae can only have 1. Change this in equity, so both councillors in both wards are seconded to the community boards. That was so specifically in relation to Waikanae and Paraparaumu. And then there were 3 further submissions received in relation to why they didn't support the councillor appointment structure, and they were in relation to removing councillors. So community boards should be realigned in sync with my suggestion to remove councillors. While the current community board representation structure has worked well for the Kapiti Coast District, the process of appointing councillors to community boards causes friction, is another comment. And then the last one is councillors are not elected and have a minimal contribution, minimal role, if any. They diminish the role of elected community board members. So those are all the submissions that we've received, read out into the session.
So that first one pointed to inconsistency.
Correct.
So that would provide a justification. Lawrence? So that first submission pointed to inconsistency,
Yes, it did.
which would provide a justification for being the same across the board,
So
presumably.
going with consistency. I'd also be interested in hearing what the community board chairs have to say in relation to this as well, obviously. I'm sure that they've got their lights on. If they haven't, they should.
Oh,
I can say that as a former community board chair, I enjoyed my relationship with the ward councillor and found the partnership I had with them progressing issues very beneficial and useful. I don't know that I would have wanted to, but certainly there's nothing, for me, there was nothing wrong with having a councillor, and I didn't feel like it diluted my role. Bede.
okay. Ask me for opinion, so I'll give you one. Yeah, but there's a couple of points that I've kind of, now that I'm talking, I'm going to make about this proposal. But in terms of having the ward councillor on the board, I've found it incredibly valuable. I mean, obviously, I've got a very good relationship with mine, and she does a very good job. Don't know about the rest of you, but obviously, key with that is both of us respecting each other's roles. So I can only speak for our board, and I think we've done that well. So it's functioned well. Obviously, experience can be different depending on who gets elected to which role. So it can't, you can't set something in place that's going to work for every board in all circumstances. But I think that having that ward councillor on the board is extremely valuable for the community board. That person's in the room for meetings that only councillors attend. So if they're not closed conversations, they can report back to us. That's really useful, and often we can refer questions to follow up. So, I mean, it plays a massive role. That question, there's a contradiction in it, because it asked about 5 represented, but in the case of Paraparaumu, there's actually 6. So you can't actually send that out to the board public and get a clear yes/no answer is one of the problems. But that's, for somebody else to think about. My big question about this, and I don't know if we're discussing this today, but that proposal has come up, so I'm going to raise it. And I hope I'm not misunderstood here. Under the legislation, the ward councillor appointed to a community board must be the ward councillor from within that ward. So we had this conversation at the last rep review when we looked at Paikokariki ward having 2 community boards and whether we could bring in a district-wide councillor, or somebody, and the answer was no, because they have to come from within that ward. So I do have a question, not necessarily an objection, but certainly a question about whether it's appropriate to have a proposal that says that we can appoint the Māori ward councillor to a community board, not because the person is the Māori community board, but because the legislation states it must be a ward councillor from that ward. Now, I know that there's a view that because it's a ward councillor, then they represent that ward. I feel that's a little bit of sophistry, because I think the intent of the legislation is to have the ward councillor from within that ward, not someone that crosses over boundaries, but there may be other arguments around that. So certainly if there was a Māori ward councillor currently in practice, I wouldn't have an issue with that person sitting on my board as a councillor in principle, except that the one I've got's excellent, so I wouldn't want that one replaced. But it's more that, just that kind of procedural question, the sort of appropriateness about having a ward councillor appointed from outside of that ward, because in real terms you may have only a very small population of, say, for example, the Raumati community vote for that person, but now it's appointed ward councillor to the board. So I think you could come up with some weird outcomes from having that. But at the same time, it does give you some flexibility that I'm comfortable with as well. So I don't have a hard view about it, but I think it's just a question that I wanted to raise.
I get where you're coming from, Bede, and I wonder if it's a bit unintended that ward was intended to be a geographic location which kind of coincided with the board, because otherwise, why wouldn't you be able to have district-wide councillors? Yeah. Cam.
Cool. Ngāmihi, thank you for the order there, Commodore, to make sure we all spoke. But certainly agree with your points there, and also some of the stuff that Bede's brought up. We have, within the Otaki Community Board, we actually have a pretty good team, and I don't think we've had a split vote, Shelley, since the chair vote. Like, it's been pretty smooth, but that won't always happen. You may not always get those same people that agree. And to me, the concept of having 6 people and the potential of a split vote where you get nowhere doesn't work for me. And so from a very simple point of view, I believe having an odd number on the board, appointed to the board, allows you to make decisions and not have stalemates. I certainly have no issue with a ward councillor being on the board. Again, it's very personality dependent. Previous ward councillor was a different person and things operated differently, whereas with Shelley, she does a great job and she's just with us as a team, which is really cool. But again, it depends on personalities. Yeah. So, and it depends on the community board personalities as well. But certainly, just from that very simple point of view, I believe there should be an odd number on the board, and the ward councillor being one ward councillor being on there gives that ability to make sure that you can make decisions and move forward. That's all.
Oh, Richard, you got your hand up online. Are you about to talk about your wonderful relationship with your ward councillor?
I love my ward councillor. Apologies for not being there live. I've got a hell of a lot of work on at the moment. I had a couple of questions, or one main question. The only and or that I could see in the proposal was for the Paraparaumu ward, which they have 2 ward councillors and they could have a 3rd district-wide or Māori ward councillor, which means they would have 3 councillors and only 4 members. And it just seemed a bit weird that Paraparaumu was the only one with the and or option. And it just made things even worse for Paraparaumu to get things done, I would have thought. The other point I'd like to make is that it is a community board, and I don't think the ward councillors should be any more than 1, so that they don't dominate the proceedings, and that the will of the people in the ward is expressed through their community board, and the councillor takes it back to the full council. He may or may not agree, or she may not agree, but they can put the perspective and then vote whatever way they want if it's a voting matter. But I think trying to have too many ward councillors is just fraught with danger. Having a Māori ward or a local ward person doesn't really matter to me, but I think Bede's point about what legally they can do is quite interesting, seeing they weren't allowed to have a community-wide councillor as their board representative. So I don't care one way or the other. I just think keeping the dominance of elected members or full council members on a community board is bad, and we should only have one person appointed. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Martin?
It's interesting, isn't it? It'll be back to front from what we have here with councillors being at the table without voting rights, but able to participate, which I think is perfectly fine. Three things from my end. First, the wording there pretty much what allows for this conversation with one councillor rather than two. Nowhere on there does it say two for Paraparaumu. Do you agree with keeping the numbers of membership of community boards to 5 represented? That's what we talked to. That's what and we've got 80% of people that agree with that. Doesn't say anything about 2 for Paraparaumu.
Not on the screen, but the initial proposal was online, so it was quite clear. There was an infographic online that outlined that, and that went with the submission, the consultation documents.
Okay.
Sorry, not in this slide. You're right.
Okay, so yeah, because I take that to read. Could be read either. It could be read either way, but that's the wording. So if you needed something to hang it on, in theory you can hang it on the wording as such. It's the same with the previous slide too, because actually your options are or. You know, one appointed member from either the Otaki General Ward or Kapiti Coast Māori Ward. So you're saying you're either going to have the Māori Ward Councillor there or you're going to have the Otaki Ward Councillor there. There's no and or and that sort of stuff, which seems weird to me because why would you have the Māori Ward Councillor there instead of the local Ward Councillor? And so, but there could be the and or added to there with regards to the Paraparaumu one. After saying that, I would prefer to see the Māori Ward Councillor being the council representative on Te Whakaminanga o Kapiti with regards to then on the community boards per se. I know we haven't consulted on that, but that's part of a delegated approach at the beginning of the triennium as such. The Māori Ward Councillor is able to go to any meeting he wants to go to, or he or she, or I suppose you can use all day, with regards to with regards to if they want to attend meetings, and potentially if there's issues that are perhaps important to them, they will go to those community board meetings to speak into them as such. But then maybe that's just an elegant way to sort that conversation out as such. Because with regards to the memorandum of partnership that we're reworking at the moment, you know, that could be part of that conversation with regards to how the representation works. And such. And, you know, again, on that document, it talks to Mata Waka. So, and, you know, part of that process ongoing, if you like, is that could be a bit of a Māori tangata whenua conduit into council for the general community, if need be, which we will discuss, I'm sure, as we develop the memorandum of partnership. As such, but maybe that's a way to approach this.
Thanks, Martin. Jocelyn?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I have to admit I'm a little bit disappointed that normally our presentations are on the hub before the briefing occurs, and this for some reason wasn't. And given the conversation, it would have been good for us to be able to see it beforehand, as you know, we are normally, well, I often look at them beforehand to actually get my head around things. So I suppose the other thing too is that I think previously we've talked about some of the questions that were in the representation review, and I think the question about representation on the community boards, another one of those questions that probably, you know, going forward, it's just really important to look at the way the questions are worded so that it's very clear that the outcome is, well, the answers you're going to get is quite clear in terms of what you're wanting to receive. So I suppose, I think last time when we also talked about this, my memory is that there were at least 2 submissions requesting 2 ward councillors were most appropriate in Waikanae. And that hasn't really been mentioned today.
I did mention before that there were 2 submissions and they were the same wording but signed by different people. So yes, I only read it out once, but it's exactly the same wording. And I can read it out again.
Okay.
So they did mention that there is a disparity in the appointment process of councillors to community boards. Paraparumu has the right for 2, whilst Waikanae can only have 1. And to change this inequity, so both councillors in both wards are seconded to the community board. So those are 2 submissions, and that's out of 442, I think.
But saying that because there was one submission, it has to be considered.
It can be considered, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I suppose, so just in relation to what Cam was saying, you know, whether you've got an uneven number or an even number, it actually gives, if it's an even number, it actually gives more power to the chair because they have the casting vote. So it's not actually a problem to actually resolve an issue, and often it doesn't come up that often either. I think having ward councillors based on the number of councillors from wards on community boards is actually important. And I understand why there aren't 3 in Paparamu, because it would actually change the dynamics. I understand that. But in terms of Waikanae, I think it is actually quite important because the community have actually voted for 2 ward councillors. And, you know, it's been said to me that I, you know, because I'm not the council rep assigned to the community board, I should act as a district-wide councillor. That is not how I've been elected. And so...
It's also not true.
No, I'm saying that.
What's not true?
What that person said.
It's you who said it, Janet.
I never said that.
You did. I've probably got it written down somewhere. So
I might have said that you have taken an oath to the whole to represent the whole district, and so being on the Waikanae Community Board isn't the sole. You don't, as a ward councillor, only focus on your ward.
I know.
That you take an oath to the whole district.
I know.
That's probably what I was talking about. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Okay, so I think, as has been mentioned before, the relationship between a ward councillor and the community board is much stronger if there is a formal association rather than personalities getting in the way. And I think it actually builds a much stronger basis for a ward councillor and for the community board because of that two-way communication. And to me, that is really important, particularly when community board members aren't always at the table. And so I suppose to me that is the crux of this. So I suppose in terms of the actual numbers there, this is actually only part of the conversation as well. So even if these people are appointed to those positions, there's been no conversation about what their role on the community board is. For example, do they sit at the table? Do they have voting rights, or do they not? And I think that actually needs to be part of this conversation as well. So I suppose as a ward councillor who's not appointed to the community board, I can sit at the table, but obviously that can change and I can just be a normal member of the public. And that's, you know, if that's what is required, then that's, I suppose, where it will end up. But I think by actually having something formally in place, it actually removes some of, as I said earlier on, some of the personalities and people know exactly what the situation is. Thank you.
Yeah, pretty much repeated what the submission said.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Nigel?
Yeah, I think the rules for when you're on a community board, whether you're a council representative or a community board member, there's a whole set of rules around how you operate as a board. Interestingly, like the 1.3% of people who thought that there should be, say, 2 on the Waikanae Community Board is about a quarter of the number of people who genuinely think that the Earth is flat. Actually, it's about 4% of people think the Earth is flat. So, 1.3%. If you start, yeah, prove it's not. There you go. Oh, sorry, 4.5%. No, I think we have to be really cautious when we take tiny percentages of people who make submissions, and then think somehow we have to act on that. 80%, it's really hard to argue with 80%. I agree with Lawrence, actually. Well, I agree with Lawrence as an interim step. I think there should be no more than 1 anywhere. I don't actually think there should be any councillors at the table. I think there's not at the table, sorry, but with the full rights that an elected community board member has. People get fixated about the fact that you have to be there in the same capacity as everybody else. If it's about offering information and being a conduit, you can do that without voting. Certainly, there's nothing to stop anybody from being at meetings and being part of it. The problem with the Paraparaumu board and having 2 appointed members is that that's the one place where you alter the proportionality, the democratic proportionality. So in the Paraparaumu ward, you have 30% of your community board are councillors, and everywhere else it's 20%. So the 30% ratio seems too high to me. Any percent seems too high to me personally, but is disproportionate. The other one is the Maori ward. The Maori ward is called a ward, and we know why it's called a ward because of the statutory requirements given that we have wards and etc. But we all know it is a district-wide role. The idea, I mean, we're kind of pretending it's a ward, but it isn't a ward. And the idea that it's even feasible, that because there isn't anything there that suggests, and I don't know what the rules are, Steffi might be able to help, but could the Maori ward councillor, in theory, be on all of the boards?
Yes, the Māori ward councillor could be appointed to all of the boards or just some of the boards.
Yeah.
Under legislation, it's also possible to only appoint the Māori ward council to say that the Otaki Community Board, but we would have to come up with clear rationale as to why we've chosen the Otaki Community Board as the only community board, for example. Yeah.
And I understand the wording, that the and/or for Paraparaumu is because there's 2. Yeah, so that's kind of, it's almost a semantic argument in there. So, but this council has been roundly criticised for ignoring submission stats before, where a large percentage of people, but in this case where 80% of people tell you go with what you've got, I think you're pretty much obligated to that. To swim against that gets a bit tricky. But yeah, so just lastly, yeah, are we in a position where we could now make any alterations to those based on the fact that 80% of people said leave it as it is?
Shelley?
First off, I feel sorry for the Māori ward councillor if they get appointed to all of the boards, but the Māori ward councillor is that, even though they've got the name Kapiti Coast Māori ward councillor, they are in effect a district-wide councillor.
So under legislation, they're a ward councillor, but yes, you're right, the boundaries align with the district. So it aligns with the boundaries of a district-wide councillor. So it is a little bit the semantics that are prescribed in the Act.
And so I'm only thinking the Māori ward conversation has already come up with a lot of controversy, which we don't want to add fuel to the fire. So maybe we could word it that the Māori ward councillor is in effect a district-wide councillor, and not throw them in this. I don't know. That to me is just going to cause kind of a bit of trouble, and it would be nice to hear from Kim what she thinks about it. But in effect, they're a district-wide councillor, and other district-wide councillors don't go on the community boards.
So hang on a minute. So there's been quite a lot of discussion about the possibility of a Māori ward councillor being appointed to a community board. I think what we need to understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steffi, is that if we allow the provision for a ward councillor to be appointed to a community board, that necessarily means that it can either be the ward councillor or the Māori ward councillor under the legislation. So it's not actually a point for debate today, and not something that we can take out of our representation review. It's something that we'll have to sort out when we do our delegations and governance structure, or whoever's around this table does the governance and delegations at the beginning of the next triennium. So actually I'd quite like to park that conversation, because actually today it's a moot point. Correct me if I'm wrong, Steffi? Have I got that right?
Okay.
Okay,
Yep.
cool.
So I do agree with Cam. I think one councillor on a community board gives the board the ability to direct the traffic, because we're actually two different entities. A community board is much more grassroots than a councillor, which is governance, and I think the chair, respecting the chair's role, they should have the vote to be able to sway a decision. And I'm wondering if one of the Paraparaumu ward councillors, I don't know whether we can change this, could be on the Raumati one, because Sophie's taken up the mantle of going to both of them, but the next Paikakariki general ward councillor might not be up for that as a thing. So is that possible?
Sorry, Steffi's going to respond to that.
So that is correct. So next triennium, if somebody else is elected, they may not want to be appointed to community boards, and this provides the flexibility in the new triennium to then have a discussion when the governance structure is set. If at the moment, if you wanted to set it differently, then we'd have to have a very clear rationale as to why the Raumati Community Board gets a Māori ward councillor appointment possibility and the others don't get it. So therefore, this just provides the most flexibility for the new triennium to discuss workloads and then appoint the right people to the right community boards. If that was the case, if the ward councillor didn't want to be appointed to two.
Well, I also think, it sounds like I was a little bit wrong before, but I also think in reality, the chances that the next group of people who are sitting around this table are going to deny the local ward councillor the right to be on a community board and vote in the Māori ward councillor instead, pretty slim. I think that expectation is that if you're the ward councillor, you kind of be most likely to be appointed. But you can't foresee the future, I guess. So I'm actually in favour of leaving it as it is. It provides the flexibility. Have a bit of trust that people are going to make the right decision. You know. Sophie?
Yeah, I'm also in favour of just one councillor on each of the community boards for the consistency kind of reasoning, and just concur with what others have said on that point. And a little bit of context too as to the potential for the Māori ward councillor to sit on any one of the community boards. I think that conversation, and maybe it was a can of worms that I opened when at one of the previous briefings suggested that the person who comes into this seat following me may not want to be on two community boards, and if the Māori ward councillor happened to be from Paikakiriki or Raumati, that those two councillors, the ward councillor and the Māori ward councillor, could come to some sort of agreement about how that workload was shared. But as the Mayor said, this gives us the flexibility to do that, depending on where the person, the Māori ward councillor, is from and feels like they kind of geographically represent, although they have district-wide responsibilities. And then also dependent on the workload of the Paikakere Hiromati ward councillor. So yeah, that was sort of the background for it, but then for consistency in terms of the proposal, the initial proposal, that option of having the Māori ward councillor sort of had to be put across all of the community board, all of the geographical community board boundaries as well. So I just think it gives the flexibility, so I'm in favour of keeping it how it is.
Bede?
Right, you're just processing some thoughts as the conversation's gone on. I'm sympathetic to that view as to why you would put the Māori ward councillor as an option. So I get that. That does make certain sense if it fits the other criteria. I think what I'm about to say may not be entirely relevant today, but might help the conversation. So if you'll indulge me, it seems to be there's a lot of politics in squabbling potential in having more than one ward councillor appointed to a ward. So if you're going to have more than one option, perhaps you need to just agree on something along the lines of the ward councillor with the most votes has first right of refusal on that seat, so that it's not open to squabbling. Personally, I'm open to, I think it should be one, because it's a function and one ward councillor can carry out that function quite well. I don't think it needs to be spread between two people, but maybe it's not just me, everybody else seems to agree too that it should just be one. But yeah, I think we also... I don't think
everybody does, but I think we're getting a kind of steer, aren't we? Yeah.
But I think we should, as a duty to the next council, we should agree on a clear process of selecting so that they're not left with messiness as to who's going to do what.
We can agree to what we agree to, but it'll be up to the next people who sit around this table to decide how they do it. And there's no provision in the legislation for us to force compliance on that. And I'll really check if I'm right this time.
I think that's a discussion on the governance structure that you can then have as to the rationale for appointing one councillor over another, yes.
Yeah, we could stick it in the current governance structure and see if it sticks for next time, I guess. Be a bit of an unusual thing to do, but it's, we could look at it. Martin?
Look, last time I talked, I really just talked to specifics on there. I just wanted to give my point of view on this because I'm a third councillor here, if you like, my reasoning behind not putting myself forward as such. Look, I agree. I think it's a community board, and I think one councillor is more than enough with regards to things. But we put a clause in our standing orders, and I read it out, number 12, and we put it at the beginning of this training, that Mayor and the Deputy Mayor may attend community board meetings with speaking but not voting rights. Ward councillors not appointed to community boards may attend meetings with speaking but not voting rights. Now, we've put that in there specifically because, in my view, you are elected in your ward. So as a councillor, it's in your interest to go along to the community board meetings, and I think you should be able to be involved. Now, from my perspective, I can offer insights, I can answer questions, all those sorts of scenarios and that sort of stuff. I don't want to do it from the floor. Respectfully, I would respectfully expect to be able to sit at that table. And so but things like the grants and the decisions of the community board are the community boards. And it's up to me to help them get from point A to point B. Now, from my perspective, second term councillor, I was more than happy to let the, not in your case, Kathy, you've been there longer than any of us, but I was happy to step back, let the new councillors take that role, because I was taking a little bit of a broader role from my perspective. I support the one councillor as such, but that's my personal view. With regards, and I respect other people's difference, because I do think it's a community board, and we want to see our community boards doing what community boards do, because quite frankly, as councillors, we've got our plates full too, but we do need to be in contact with them and working on projects or working constructively with the community boards. But it needs to be also from that point of respect, in my opinion, because the community has voted councillors into the role to represent their particular wards, and I think it's important that there is that linkage there as well, and you're not necessarily there on the grace of the chair or the community board members, because that's when personalities get involved. And that's when it gets very awkward with regards, and I think personalities need to be removed from this equation, because that's what's been the problem in the past.
Yeah, welcome to democracy. Councillor Cooper.
I'm actually on that community board, there's two, and I actually think that Kathy and I bring two completely different skills, attributes to the board, and it's actually worked really well. We, my certainly view is I'm there to support the community board members, and are led by them, and Marty comes along to most meetings, which is fantastic, and Marty adds value as well. I know Bernie might have, with Glenn not being here, maybe Bernie could speak to how it is working. He may have a different view than I have, but I think it works really well. We don't overpower the other members. In fact, I think we support them and make it a better place. But maybe Bernie could works right for
Do you
us.
want to say anything about that, Bernie?
I agree with what Glenn, Councillor Cooper has said. I've got no problem. The only thing is, for our community board, the chair does not have a casting vote. We deliberately took that away from the chair. So he only has one vote, and there was a specific reason for that, based on the previous training. That's all. I think what Councillor Cooper says, I endorse.
Yeah, so there's nothing stopping ward councillors from supporting community boards, regardless of whether they've got a voting right on the board. So what I'm hearing in general, having heard that, is that we're wanting a bit of consistency, and we're listening to the submissions that gave us a steer that we could do that. I'm hearing a preference for just having one on each community board. Have we got any more slides? No, that's it. Great. Okay, lunchtime. See you soon.